Late Night with Cristo Foufas on talkRADIO.
So why is there a labour shortage? Should the government have been prepared for this? You're going to sleep to the news of apparently we need more foreign butchers because we've got to prevent this mass cull of pigs. At midnight, there are new figures coming out of the number of vacancies, which are pretty eye-watering. We've got warehouses full to the brim because we haven't got enough people to move the stock. Are the government to blame for this? Have we perhaps, in our good intentions in voting to leave the EU as well, found ourselves in a situation where we've not prepared ourselves here in the UK to train more British workers to want to do some of these jobs? And is that perhaps down to a snobbery we've had over the years? Well, let's talk about the reasons why this is happening and what can solve this. Connor Tomlinson is a political commentator. Jonathan Liz is the Deputy Director of British Influence. Both join me now. Evening to you, gentlemen.
Evening, gents.
So let's start with you, Jonathan. Is this all down or partly down to Brexit?
Well, if you're talking about the general shortages that we have in this country right now, obviously Brexit is a factor. I wouldn't say that Brexit was the only reason. But obviously we had a major pandemic, which in particular HGV drivers led to a shortage of, an inability for people to take tests. And then obviously a lot of people went back to countries in Eastern Europe during lockdown. But obviously they also went back because the government told them they effectively weren't welcome anymore. That was a message of the last 5 years. And many of them now have not come back because of Brexit, partly because they need to apply for visas, and partly because they can have better, more secure jobs elsewhere in the EU with full citizenship rights afterwards. And so obviously Brexit is aggravating and accentuating a problem which has been caused elsewhere. So I wouldn't say that it was everything, but it's certainly a big factor. I
mean, Connor, would you say that that's a fair comment? I think that sounds like a pretty fair analysis. It's not the whole story, but it's certainly a part of the story.
I'd agree it's part of the story. You definitely had the trends in 2019 prior to the lockdown, where lots of people were going home, particularly to places like Poland, and then there were comparisons between average wages in Britain and average wages in Eastern Europe, and both were going up because of the relative reallocation of people who had come to the UK for work and gone back, and it seemed to be a net positive for both countries. Of course, the market wasn't allowed to sort itself out over a year of lockdown, so it exacerbated the problems of people not being able to find their place of work in that time. My only contention would actually be, I don't particularly agree that sort of demonization of people from particular areas of the EU has played a factor in a reluctance to come over, because even during lockdown, during COVID, during 2020 and 2021, we kept up the level of net migration increase with about 300,000 net intake every year. And we kept that up even during the pandemic. I think it's probably more an issue, not of population. We've got quite a large incumbent workforce base between a lot of the refugees and also legal migrants. But it's more a case of specification. You can't get people to do HGV drivers, for example, because there's a shortage in training and the butchery. And you've got a lot of what would be called low-skilled labour, but also the pay isn't great. And I don't think it's demonisation. I think it's more just labour specification.
I take a little issue with that, because I think that I don't think Leave voters voted for this, and I don't think people who voted Leave, I think a lot of them were just wanting things to be better. That's what you vote in whatever direction you vote for in anything. But I think some of the voices over the European Union referendum that we heard were pretty toxic towards people who were from other countries. And, for instance, what pops into my head is Farage talking about Romanians, for instance. And there were those sorts of comments made throughout the campaign by certain people. And I would imagine if you are someone who is from one of those countries working here in a job that is perhaps quite demanding, that wouldn't make you feel great.
I mean, I don't remember the particular quote in
he said he wouldn't want to live next door to a family of Romanians, or words to that effect. If he had the choice, he wouldn't. Right. And I think that was not the kind of helpful rhetoric that was probably needed if we're talking about reasons why people might have wanted to come back.
Yeah, I'll take you on your word for that, because obviously I don't remember it. If he said that, it's a bit daft. Of course, I do think, though, the general point, and this was made at the Tory Party conference, for example, even though they claim to have ended free movement, but again, the net intake of migration is still quite up, that it's not so much about the location of the country or the specification of the labour, but just the fact that if you have a net intake of people, and it is low-skilled labour, so manual jobs, shop floor, things you don't require a lot of training for, you can sort of slot in and hand your CV in and start on the job, it depreciates the wage pool, and it means that wages are driven down. And that's how you can excuse things like 0-hour contracts. And especially with the non-legal workers that are coming in by the boatload at the moment. And we've seen in the past with places in, where was it? Was it Luton? Where you had a massive amount of essentially slave labor, and all these Sports Direct warehouses, a lot of the Amazon warehouses were found to have really poor conditions because people weren't on the books. So they could be exploited like that.
I mean, Jonathan, do you think that any of those are fair comments? I mean, and also, off the back of that, I've had a go at some of the people in the Leave side of the referendum, but also some of the absolute chaos and hysteria, I'll include myself in some of that came from the Remain side after the referendum result. That also didn't create a particularly helpful atmosphere when it came to trying to solve some of the problems that we're finding today, did it?
Well, I mean, I think it would be ludicrous to blame the Remainers for people wanting to leave the country or not wanting to come back, when Remainers were advocating for free movement of people and saying that EU citizens are being treated terribly. I mean, it's you can't possibly blame Remainers for that policy.
Can we not blame Remainers for the little bit of limbo that we found ourselves in? Remainers in Parliament, Remainers who didn't really
No, I'm sorry, no. Like, I'm very happy to accept where the Remain campaign went wrong, where Remainers went wrong. There are many, many mistakes made. But sort of the asking, just trying to, have a policy where there would be a second referendum after, an election, for example, was a perfectly legitimate vote, perfectly legitimate tactic and policy, particularly where it wasn't at all clear that what people had voted for was coming to pass, as we have seen over and over again in the last 5 years. But I don't think we need to re-litigate that. In particular, what I would say is that Remainers certainly, even though we wanted free move to people and still do want it, many of us, I would agree that clearly there was an aspect of exploitation in a lot of these jobs. And, I think it's perfectly legitimate to say that people should be paid better. People should have better working conditions. We should not be relying on poorly paid labour. But, you have a country like Germany, that's not a matter of being in the EU or not. That's a matter about how we treat people in our workforce. Germany, obviously, depends on free movement to people as well, but it's a high-skilled, high-wage economy. And so, it's nothing to do with being in the EU. That's kind of like a false premise.
All right. Well, look, we're going to come back. We're going to take a quick break. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about whether we've got some solutions to all this, and also whether there's a little bit of a snobbery around some of these jobs that we need to try and encourage British people to get into. So we'll talk about that coming up right here on Talk Radio. And we're still talking about the labour shortages. We've got Connor Tomlinson, the political commentator, Jonathan Liss as well, Deputy Director of British Influence. I want to read you both a tweet, actually, from Jacqueline, saying, "I'm sorry, Cristo, I can't hold my tongue anymore." Well, she's typing, so... but anyway, the Remainers can thank Tony Blair for our skill shortages, encouraging half of school leavers to go and do a degree and accumulate debt, inflated egos that won't do manual work. And also many other people have spoken about the Blair years in tweets to me, saying that obviously there was this obsession with university education, but also during that time there was a lot of EU immigration for those lower skilled jobs, even though I hate that expression, and the combination gave us this perfect storm of where we are right now. Connor, what do you say to that?
I'd agree. I actually think it's a wider scale problem, because both parties have been a bit of a uniparty on this issue, because of course the Tories encouraging a lot of people to go to university, even up to Theresa May's years, to essentially drive down artificially the unemployment numbers. Because if you stick a bunch of people post-18 into education for 3 or 4 years, your unemployment numbers look a lot better than they actually are. And a lot of these roles that are meant to be quote unquote low skilled are actually filled part-time by students who are working alongside their degree just to make ends meet. During sixth form, for example, did quite a few of those shop floor jobs. I did 2 or 3 at once at one point. So I think there is definitely a snobbery around university in that a lot of the students go to university, are encouraged to get pointless degrees, and then glut the HR departments of a lot of corporations. And so fair enough, they don't want to go back to a job that's making substantially less than a graduate salary. But sometimes it is necessary to make that stopgap if you aren't making it in a lot of the media degrees, for example, that a lot of people do, but they really aren't as creative as they think.
Well, especially with the debt after it. I mean, Jonathan, are the Blair years partly to blame for this? Not only our obsession with university, but the situation we found ourselves in with a lot of our reliance on foreign workers for a lot of these jobs, and also perhaps this idea of a slight snobbery that we have towards some of these lower skilled, lower paid jobs, when in actual fact it used to be in the UK that it was perfectly acceptable to leave school and start at the bottom, do the job that might not be particularly skilled, washing up the dishes in a kitchen, but you might end up the chef in years to come. I mean, is that part of a problem here?
Well, I don't think that you can blame Blair for either of those two things, partly because, well, actually, the polytechnics was the transformation of polytechnics into universities was started by John Major, actually. But I don't think you can ever say that increasing social mobility, sort of turning university from being a rarefied pursuit for mostly rich people who were the children of university graduates into something that was accessible to a far greater proportion of the population is something either to apologise for or to call snobbery. It's quite the reverse, actually. It's kind of a democratization. Now, I also, on a philosophical note, don't like the idea of pointless degrees. I don't think any education is pointless. We're not just workhorses. We fetishize work in this country. There's more to life than work. There's also something about getting an education, experiencing university, having that sort of, those 3 years where you can actually explore who you are as a human being. Now, obviously, that's not right for everyone. Not everyone should necessarily go to university or has to go to university. But I would never seek to dissuade people from going to university. I do think, obviously, there is an issue of people getting to debt, which is a separate issue. And obviously, I
but it does become pointless,
increasing tuition fees. So, but also,
if you've got loads of debt when you come out of university and you've got a degree that you can't get a job in, I think that has two effects. Firstly, you find yourself in a situation where perhaps you don't want to go back, as Connor was saying, to that lower paid, less skilled job because you've now got a degree and you've got all that debt to show for the degree. Secondly, you've got to pay off all that debt. Thirdly, doesn't it employ a culture in the country where it's education or nothing? I'm obsessed in this country with the fact that we are so obsessed with academia that if you're someone who's not particularly academic, I feel like there's no route for you here in the UK. There is a little bit of a snobbery, not just about people going to university, but towards people then who aren't that academic. And aren't we actually getting the brunt of that now?
I think that we're a lot less snobbish than sort of countries like France, for example, where the intellectual is fetishized. The public intellectuals are accepted as part of society. Where in this country, there's kind of a reverse snobbery about them. Now, obviously, that's a kind of a cultural thing. Economically, clearly, people who've been to university, people who are middle class, have such a deeply stratified class system that obviously, even if there's reverse snobbery, the people who've been to university, who do have those degrees, who come from middle class backgrounds, are more likely to be better paid, for example. But I think there is an issue, of course, with snobbery as well, in that people are not encouraged to take on those jobs, as you say. But at the same time, we do have a lot of people who do work in manual labour, who do work in service in this country, and the answer to that is to make those jobs something that people would actually want to do and like to do, by raising working conditions, by raising wages and giving people a fair wage so they don't have to be on benefits while they're actually in work, as so many people actually are in this country. And so for me, that's the way I approach it from a political angle as well, that you raise wages if you kind of allow people to live decent lives doing those jobs that not everyone wants to do. And at the same time, there will be some jobs that people won't want to do. Culturally, we don't, people aren't getting up to pick fruit at 3 a.m. So a lot of people are not training to work in abattoirs or whatever. And that's why I think the elasticity of the labour market that can be filled by people from abroad.
I think that's precisely why. I think that we used to in this country see those sorts of jobs as perfectly good opportunities, and I think now that we perhaps don't want to do that anymore. And also, I'll add to that, and Connor, maybe you can comment on this. I think the government have been completely caught on the back foot. I mean, if people voted to leave the EU, and we had COVID as well, where we knew that there would be a situation where we would have certain jobs unfilled, I don't know whether it's just the chaos of having a buffoon as a prime minister, or whether it's the cowardice to actually have to say to people who voted leave, many of whom voted leave exactly for this reason. But I don't know why the government couldn't say, right, we actually are going to end up with a skills shortage in this field, so we're going to go to these countries, as they're having to do today, and say, we need a workforce to fill this particular job, and this is what you voted for. And I feel like the government are scared to do that because they think that the Leave voters will have some sort of meltdown about that.
There's a lot to respond to both you and John, so I'll try and remember it all if I can. First of all, the idea that there isn't nonsense degrees. I'm really glad you brought up the French, Jonathan, because their postmodernism has infected plenty of university courses, including my own. And I can tell you that plenty of people, one, didn't put the work in when they went to uni. It was basically a 3-year party ditch, and they came out with a result that was far less capable than they actually were. There was also a lot of grade inflation that a lot of students who weren't putting the work in and sort of did things the night before were actually scraping through with things they didn't deserve. And a lot of the degrees don't actually transfer into jobs, even the performing arts ones, for example, where if you aren't doing a job outside of it and you aren't actually doing something acting or a separate theatre company, and that you don't get the actual on the ground experience that can lead into a role with different connections. Instead, it's not 1% of all people that go and do a dance degree actually do the West End. Second of all, the idea that the EU isn't at fault for the migration issue and that the government's just not had time to prepare and it wasn't the Remainers' fault. I'd like to separate between Remainers like yourself, Cristo, and rejoiners like that clown Steve Bray, who goes outside Parliament Square all the time. I think if the government was so distracted for quite so long by defectors in their own rank and the faction of the country who decided to be quite traitorous and try and split off and overturn democracy and go back to the EU, they would have had more time to put in provisions rather than just fighting among ourselves and having a pretty bad Brexit deal, which was about as fair as most divorce settlements. But then again, but to be fair, they threw out the Great Barrington Declaration too, so I don't much trust the government to commit to their own planning.
I mean, Jonathan, you look like you're losing the will to live during what Connor had to say there, so I've got to give you a chance to respond.
No, I'm just so tired of hearing the word treachery when it comes to Brexit. It's just, there are no traitors in the Brexit debate. It's not something that I just can't bear the idea that people were somehow opposing a kind of a government policy. They were somehow against their country. It's such a
wasn't a government policy. It was voted on. It had the final word. The referendum was binding.
I'm not saying you, collective you. Sorry, Remainers are not traitors. There is no Remainer who was a traitor.
The rejoiners were traitors. I didn't say just Remainers.
Be more insistent on this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm trying to balance things a little bit, look, I think that there were people after the referendum, and I can say it because I think I was probably one of them, that completely freaked out, thought it was awful, didn't want the result to take place, and I was very similar to that until we had a decisive election result as to getting Brexit done. But I think, Connor, it is a fair point to say that whilst we had an election, and look, I don't want to replay the referendum, but we have to get this out. Whilst we were in a situation where we had that disastrous 2017 election, where we had a hung parliament, and essentially the country said, we have no idea who we want to negotiate Brexit, because we've not given anyone a clear mandate. We've no idea of what kind of Brexit that we want. We can't actually even get a withdrawal agreement over the line because there weren't the numbers in Parliament to do so. I would say during that period, it was perfectly reasonable for people who voted Remain to say, well, look, we don't even know what kind of Brexit we're going to have and who's going to negotiate it. I don't think that that's treachery. I think that after 2019, and there was a decisive majority if you kept it on that route, I wouldn't call you treacherous, but I'd say you need to get over it because the country has decided. But during that period, the country hadn't.
For a second referendum after 2019 election, clearly that policy was defeated. So that's
isn't that a fair balance of a fair analysis?
Actually, well, because
hang on, we're out of time. Jonathan, Connor, you go first, then Jonathan.
Thank you very much. I disagree because actually 2017 was my first election. I couldn't bring myself to vote for Theresa May because she felt very much like, when someone's asked to do the housework, you get your kids to do the dishes and they do it so badly that you have to then go and do it yourself and you never ask them again. So we were essentially voting between Corbyn, who seemed to be a soft Brexiteer, but also a communist, and then Theresa May, who was a pretty staunch Remainer and then doing Brexit so reluctantly that it could just be passed off as either incompetence or malice. So I don't think the 2017 hung parliament was actually a vote between, oh, we don't know who we want to negotiate this thing and we might want to redo it. I think it was a lot of Brexiteers actually turning around and saying, well, I can't trust either of you to do it. So I'm not sure really sure.
But that's not a problem with Remainers who then said, well, the result came from that and said, well, there you go. No one knows what you want. It's not the fault of Remainers that no one trusted the two people that were put forward to negotiate it. You can't call Remainers treacherous for actually just reacting to exactly what you've just described.
Were treacherous. I think the Remainers who actually voted Remain and were like, okay, look, we've got to accept it. The people that wanted to push for a second referendum just because they thought they'd have the chance to win to then rejoin were treacherous because you'd already had the.
Well, then that would include me because during that period I was one of those people.
Sorry, this is completely outrageous. This is not the conversation I thought we were going to have.
No, I didn't think we were going to either.
Because I'm sorry, I'm so tired of the idea that democratic opposition is opposition to democracy or opposition to your country. It is simply not true. There are people who saw that Brexit was going to be a disaster, that all the things that have been promised in the referendum campaign were simply based on lies, as Dominic Cummings admits all the time, by the way, and they were pushing to give people a second say. And now we simply don't know whether people would have voted for Remain if they'd been given the chance to, because in the 2019 election, for example, 52 to 53% of people voted for parties that were in favour of Remain or Revoke. So I don't know, and neither do you, about which of those people would have voted for Remain if they'd been given the chance. The idea that you get one chance of democracy to make your opinion known, and that's all the chance you get, is total nonsense. If it were true, then there would never be another general election again, and anyone sort of saying, I'm going to vote Labour now and just have a Labour government would be a traitor as well. Because
it was never acted on in the first place. That was the point. The result of the first referendum was not being acted on. That's
because it couldn't be, because the country had given a hung parliament, so it was in complete limbo.
But this is my point. The parliament was hung because the faith in the actual two leaders to enact the will of the people was so little. The Conservative support particularly wasn't there, and that's why you see a massive swing when Boris came in. Obviously, Boris is disappointed since.
An ardent Remainer himself.
An entire lie, by the way.
And then his campaign was based on Brexit.
Anyway, look, we are where we are. Let's try and solve it, and hopefully going forward we can. We've even all acknowledged that Brexit isn't the whole reason why we're here, so I don't know how we ended up down.
I miss 2016, don't you, Cristo?
Down this rabbit hole. I nearly put my head in my hands myself there, because I even said to my producer, let's not rerun the referendum in this conversation, but sadly we did. But I did enjoy it, and I hope you two did too, and I hope that, Jonathan, you don't want to go and, drink a bottle of vodka now, because you really look like
ibuprofen, mate.
Have some ibuprofen, did you say? I don't know if he needs that either. Thank you, Connor Tomlinson. Thank you, Jonathan Liss. What do you make of all of that? It always ends up going down that road, doesn't it?